So we need a motion to approve the agenda, which you should have on your iPad.
Just a motion to approve the agenda.
I'm looking at the items on said motion. Approval of minutes doesn't apply because we don't actually have this.
We're just going to approve the agenda.
Okay, but the agenda is an information item of discussion of public comments.
Yes, I would move the agenda, Mr.
Okay.
Chair.
Second?
Second? Is there any further discussion on that? All in favor of approving the agenda as presented, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you, we have an agenda. All right, so I think for introductions, let's just start at one end, work your way through, say what your name is, which of the two bodies you're with, or if you're support staff, and what district you represent or where that is generally in town. Start over there.
Sarah Hippus, and with District F, which is out Washington County mostly.
Wendy Wolf, I'm on both. Liaison of the Parks and Open Space Commission, and on the council I am District 16, which is the southern 3/4 of Dakota County and a corner of Scott County as well.
I'm Anthony Taylor with IMPOSC, and I represent District G in St. Paul.
Rich Kramer, District 13, which you are in. East side of St. Paul, west side of St. Paul, downtown St. Paul, St. Paul Park, West St. Paul, South St. Paul, etc. One half of Great Cloud Island Township.
I am Catherine Fleming. I have District D. I'm with IMPOS, and that encompasses most of Minneapolis up to St. Anthony.
I'm Bob Moeller. I represent District B of the MPOS, which is Scott County and Carver County and the western part of Hennepin County.
Gail Dorfman with the Community Development Committee, and I represent District 6 on the Met Council, which is Minneapolis, St. Louis Park, Golden Valley, Crystal, New Hope. I think that's it. I'm Lisa Barajas. I'm the Community Development Director.
I'm John Commerce. I represent District 14 on that council, and that is St. Paul.
And I'm Tony Russo. As MPOS chair, I serve at large, so my district is the whole region. I live in Washington County.
I'm Michelle Wenner. I'm the recording secretary for the Community Development Committee.
Steve Chavez, council member, committee member for Community Development Committee. District 15, which includes Egan, Inver Grove Heights, Rosemount, and Burnsville. Never forget Burnsville.
Deb Barber, Met Council member of Community Development Committee. I represent District 4, which is all of Carver County except the city of Chanhassen, and all of Scott County except for the 4 townships south of Prior Lake, which Wendy represents.
I'm Todd Kimmery, and I'm with MPOSC. I represent Dakota County and eastern Scott County.
Steve Elkins. I represent Council District 5, which is Bloomington, Edina, Richfield, and Hopkins.
Rick Tyson, A is my area, and Brooklyn Park, and most of Maple Grove, if not all.
And I'm Jennifer Munt. I'm the Vice Chair of Community Development, and I represent District 3 on the council. That includes Minnetonka, Eden Prairie, Chanhassen, and 13 additional suburbs in southwestern Hennepin County.
Okay, thank you. And with that, I'm ready to turn it over to John, who will lead our discussion from here.
Great, thank you very much. And welcome everyone to our joint meeting. Looking forward to the conversation. I think what we're going to start with is a presentation of the key themes. I'm sure you've had a chance to take in the 197 pages of public comment, and I know that many of us have had plenty of conversations also that have supplemented those written comments. But we'd like to start with a presentation to kind of walk through what are the key themes of the public comment, and then we can dive into consideration of each of those. Look forward to it.
Good afternoon, Metropolitan Parks and Open Space Commission members and Community Development Committee members. I'm Emmett Mullen, and I'm the manager of the Regional Parks Unit. And with Libby Starling and Dan Markell down there, we'll be walking through the information item on the public comments received for the Regional Parks Policy Plan. So a little overview of today's discussion. We really want to give you a summary of what was heard during the public comment period. We want to review the issues where public comments suggest remaining tension, as Tony was just saying, and to get direction to inform revisions to the draft policy plan. We want to give a brief overview of the consensus themes that arose from the comments, and then we're going to go over a little timeline and next steps. So, who we heard from. During the public comment period, which was July 26th through September 27th, 2018, we heard from over 100 unique individuals and organizations. 15 individuals commented at your last Community Development Committee public hearing, so verbally. We got written letters from 8 of the 10 regional park implementing agencies. We heard from one elected official, Councilmember Cam Gordon in Minneapolis. There were 10 organizations that submitted written comments. We received 84 comments from residents, and we got 7 voicemails from commentors. So I wanted to start today by acknowledging the tremendous show of interest in this policy plan update. I think that the root of this interest is really people's love of our regional park system. People know that we have an amazing system. It's one thing that, even though we may have disagreements on the details, it's one thing we all share in common, is this real regard for the regional park system. This was a comment from Lorenzo Tunisi, who I honestly have never met. I'd like to commend all who have worked on this plan as well as the plan update. It's thanks to your work that we currently and our descendants will later enjoy such wonderful amenities. Thanks to your forward-looking vision, we rest assured that generations to come will be able to get away from the day-to-day urban life and take advantage of green space. It takes courage and hard work. Thank you, Lorenzo Tunisi. So I thought that was nice. Here are the 5 themes that we're going to walk through and discuss today as a large group. This is where we really want to hear from you in terms of finishing out the Regional Parks Policy Plan. The first theme is around allowable recreational activities. The second theme is around balancing natural resources conservation and facility development. The third theme is coordination with transportation planning. The fourth theme is priorities for the 2019 System Edition conversation that we're planning to take up. And then finally, we want to talk about the equity toolkit use and project prioritization. Those are the 5 themes. What we're going to do within each of these themes is just provide a little background about what the current draft plan says about the issue. We'll provide a few examples that demonstrate the range of comments that we've received, and then we'll pose a discussion question and ask for your advice. And I promise that is going to be the emphasis here as soon as we get through these intros. We hope to take about 10 or 15 minutes with each theme area, 10 or 15 minutes of discussion. So with that, I will jump into theme 1. And this is, what does the plan say about allowable recreation activities? Just a little background. Chapter 7 covers recreation activities and facilities. This is on pages 91 to 99 of the updated policy plan, so the draft. Strategy 1 calls for a balance of conservation and recreation. But what we're focusing on here is activities. So primary activities include activities that date from the inception of the Regional Parks Policy Plan. So things like biking, hiking, camping, picnicking, sort of the traditional activities. It also identifies secondary activities that, as it says in the slide, complement the primary use. Strategy 2 describes the range of recreational opportunities that exist across the regional park system, so from developed to rustic, so that wide range. Comments that we heard about allowable secondary activities. So this is in addition to those picnicking, hiking, bicycling, and so forth. The first comment is from Ann Shadrick of Farmington. She said, eliminate the language for expansion of undefined recreation amenities. She was referring specifically to secondary activities. The second comment is from the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board staff, and it says, the question is not what the activities should be included or excluded, but how activities are appropriately designed into the natural character of the regional park. The comment does go on, and you can read this in the comments, just to say that what is allowed should really be driven through the master planning and public engagement process. So the third comment on secondary activities is from Dakota County, and it says, the county supports the establishment of clear definition and performance criteria for secondary or support facilities in coordination with park agencies, other partners, and stakeholders. We did hear from a number of skateboarders, so I just thought it would be important to highlight one of their comments. And this is from the City of Skate, which is an actual nonprofit organization. So the City of Skate said they would ask that the 2040 plan include language to support and fund skate parks within regional parks. Skate parks should be designed to complement the landscape and with the possibility of water management. Two Minneapolis regional parks, Nokomis-Hiawatha Regional Park and Bede-Makaska, already have community-approved skate parks in their master plans that will serve youth from throughout Minneapolis and the metropolitan area. A 2013 MPRB survey with 1,400 respondents found the #1 location for a desired skate park was within the Bede-Makaska Regional Park. Skateboarding as an Olympic sport is an equity activity that serves a youth demographic that needs to be encouraged to use and discover our regional parks. So the discussion question, and I really will stop talking now, is how should allowable activities be defined in the regional park system? By whom and with what specificity?
Thank you for kicking us off. That's an excellent and challenging beginning.
Yeah.
What are committee members' thoughts on this issue?
Another question?
Yes.
Is it true
Fleming.
that the new draft states that activities in regional parks should balance the conservation and restoration of natural resources with the provision of recreational opportunities? Is that the actual wording?
I believe you're referring to page 91, lines 7 and 8, correct?
Mm-hmm.
That is in the current draft.
Okay.
You have
Yeah, I was just curious as to, I know that's a change from the old wording. What is the intent of that comment?
I can speak to that.
Okay.
We've had some conversation in the past. The old wording says that, I don't have it loaded yet, but it says something about they should involve the natural resources but not adversely impact them.
Mm-hmm.
And the concern there is that any activity that a human undertakes is going to have an adverse impact on the environment in some
Sure.
form.
Mhm.
So we either need to find a way to quantify what's an acceptable level of impact or find a different way of saying that. And this was staff's attempt at finding a different way of saying that. With the overriding intent being we want to be doing stuff that's there because it's a natural environment, but make sure that we don't have activities that destroy that reason for being there in the process of being there. So finding some kind of balance between they need to be activities that are dependent on the natural ecosystem, but also respect it while doing so.
And will that be subjective from the public's perspective, or, I mean, who will make that call?
That's kind of done.
It seems to me that this is certainly the appropriate forum for that question to be addressed, and this is the appropriate document to carry that kind of message.
Mr. Chair.
Councilmember Chavez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Perhaps to help structure this a little bit, while I've been processing this since we touched on it on the Community Development Committee meeting previously, and I had floated the rhetorical or theoretical concept at that time about zones in a particular park, which would focus on intensity of use and types of uses. I'm wondering if, in order to be respectful to the agencies, as well as to the region, as well as to users, if it would make sense to establish a handful of principles. It could be 3, I don't know, 4, no long list, by which it would guide the agencies to arrive at the uses that could make sense. For example, when we talk about balance between the resource and the use, well, on the one hand, and we're talking also about adverse impact to the resource. Well, the concept that comes to mind for me is erosion, about a particular use. So then a solution, I'm not advocating the solution, is pavement. Well, then we get down to the discussion about pavement rather than the use or the erosion. So I think we need to come back to the point of what principles are we willing to help shape, and if the decision is going to reside with the agencies and or an advisory committee that we already have at the table to work with those agencies in a collaborative method to help shape which type of a use might be appropriate in what part of their particular park, unless those agencies have their own advisors.
Thank you. I think that's an excellent comment. Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There is a list of criteria on the bottom of page 91 that sort of, it's more than 3, but it sort of lays out principles. I think, I mean, talking about the skate park things, I'm nervous about doing anything that competes with city parks. A lot of cities have city skate parks. A lot of cities have big athletic complexes with soccer fields or baseball fields or whatever. And there are certainly people who think that the regional park system has a whole bunch of money and so they could provide those facilities. But when we're looking at, what was it, a $2.6 billion budget of stuff that hasn't been built yet in our regional parks, that actually is not the case that we should be taking on extra things. To me, that's more of a case that we need to focus our efforts on those things that are unique to the regional park system. We wanted, I like the idea of evaluating each other activity on, is it nature-based? Is it all these criteria? But there are some things that are pretty clearly city park things, and I don't want to get in the business of competing with the city parks.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Commissioner Taylor.
Thank you. One of the tensions in this question is, are we willing, and actually we just left our meeting talking about community engagement. And I think that one of the challenges we have, especially as we look at regional parks in Minneapolis and in St. Paul specifically, as more regionally placed, I think Ramsey County is having this conversation, is that there's a changing demand. And I think that, a skate park is an actually great example. That if you, at Theodore Wirth, where I spend a lot of time, there are probably a lot of people that think a skate park would be very well placed at Theodore Wirth Park relative to the community's needs, or desire, right? And there's a tension there. But in terms of what is the impact on the natural environment there, that's something that we would have to decide. And right now, one of the tensions is that as there is a demographic shift towards community members that consider themselves, so I would say describe themselves as urban. Maybe that's a good way, that they are beginning to have a different set of standards around what they want in regional parks that are close to their homes. And that this is something that we're seeing right now. And the question maybe for us also is if this is happening, if that is something that the community is requesting, are we willing to follow that? Are we willing to take that and decide that there is a changing standard relative to what they want in the community? Or are we working to advise that and direct it in a way that at minimum, as we move through this process and we are working to maintain a standard that relates to these ideas around balance, around connecting to what we are considering outdoors, in a way that the community at minimum moves through that process and feels heard and feels that they have been involved and engaged, because I think that's something that we're running into right now.
Mm-hmm. Councilman Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And we've had this come up in the past in regional parks. Like a lot of the older regional parks had golf courses in them before they became regional parks. Golf is not on that list. So that still can happen in the regional park, but it doesn't count towards regional park money, because there's a formula that decides based on your acreage and your visitors and your expenditures and whatnot, what parts of state pots of funding that you get. And to me, that's a good compromise if you want to do some things that are outside the box. I mean, even golf courses will sometimes, if you have cross-country ski trails on them in the winter, then they get counted in the winter for the money, but they don't get counted in the summer when the golfers are on there. And there's been a few other little things, basketball courts or things like that, that have gone into regional parks where we've just said, okay, you just draw a little line around that property, and that doesn't count for the money, but you can put that activity in there to bring people in and accommodate those needs.
Thank you. Councilmember Dorfman.
So, thank you. So question, this list of eligible activities that meet the criteria that are in the plan, though, I mean, when's the last time that list was changed and other activities were added?
That's a great question for our staff.
Councilmember Dorfman, Chair Commerce and Yaruso, that dates to the inception of the 1974 creation of the regional park system. So it's sort of.
I don't even know if we had skateboards at that point.
Yeah, there were skateboards.
Were there skateboards? I don't remember.
Mr. Chairman, I was on the commission when we redid the 2040 plan, and we spent a great deal of time talking about each of these items and also the philosophy of nature-based activities versus urban. What I guess we later looked upon as municipal park kinds of activities. So I would say that when we did the 2040 plan, and I believe that was around 2015, we went through these in some depth.
Reviewed them.
Thank you, Commissioner. Councilman Wolf.
Not only did we go through this list, but we also, people were throwing out other things that they would like to have on there. We had long discussions about whether those other things should be on there, and we're not able to come to agreement that there should be other things added.
Those are helpful comments. I want to focus on those for a moment because Councilmember Chavez's point about building a set of principles that would help address some of the, I think, the tensions that have been, often discussed during this process about what is an eligible activity and what is not an eligible activity in the regional park system. I'm wondering if committee members feel like these principles have helped us address those questions, or if that maybe is a call for more specificity in these principles, or other changes that might be helpful to address these sort of ongoing questions about what is an eligible activity and what is not in the regional parks. I want to respect entirely the work that has gone into developing these in the first place, and I think they're good. But I'm just curious if that's on committee members' minds. Yes, Commissioner Tyson.
I think at the core, what we're really dealing with are assumptions that we've made over time for any number of reasons, even something as basic as the 2080 split in park preserve usage. And it really comes back to, what's the rationale for the assumptions, and the assumptions still stand because they certainly do apply to the definition of allowable activities. And so I think it really requires that we examine some of the assumptions that we've made, for better or for worse, all along, in many ways. And if we begin to do that, even things like skate parks, for example, begin to be considered. And also, we haven't really, maybe we're still assuming that everybody who uses the park system is 35 or younger. As a 76-year-old, I'd suggest that that's not quite where it's at anymore. And we need to look at the demographics in terms of how we're operating and what we're going to be doing, especially in terms of the definition of allowable activities. We just need to, bottom line is we need to evaluate the assumptions that we've worked with in the past.
Yes,
I think
Commissioner Uruso.
it's helpful when you look at the fact that this is talking about recreation activities and facilities together, because it's really kind of the pairing. You can't look at either alone. And the current version of the plan has some call out to that, how you evaluate against. For instance, it has a section talking about evaluating rollerblading as an instance. And similar with the skateboarding, like skateboarding just down a trail would obviously be an allowed use. And if you maybe had a ledge or a rail alongside that, jumping onto that occasionally isn't necessarily a big deal. But then there's sort of a gray line as you transition to what we normally think of as a skate park, as a traditional just set block with a bunch of different things, might not. How would you transition between those? So it's not just the activity or just the facility, but kind of how they interact. Are you doing the activity in a way that interacts with the facility in a way that interacts with the natural resource? So I think we kind of have a sense in all of our heads of what that looks like, but I don't know if we're articulating it very well. And so like that's some of the things where the previous plan says, yeah, there might be things that aren't specifically called out on this list, but these are the kinds of things we would consider to look at whether that makes sense, not necessarily whether we would add them to the list of known good activities, but in a particular instance, how do we evaluate that? And for that kind of thing, I do think this list of the general criteria that we have do work pretty well, but they don't necessarily give us clear-cut things about a list of activities like we wanted. but there are some where it's like, okay, yeah, this activity we know is fine. Things that aren't on that list maybe require further scrutiny. That's not the same as saying they're just not allowed. And then there are some things that, we've already gone over that, and that's just not allowed. So it might be helpful to kind of call out things that we know aren't good, and then there's the gray area in how we evaluate.
Mm-hmm. Commissioner Taylor.
Yeah, and Tony, as you say that, so when I hear you say that, what I really read this as is facility. What we're really looking at is the impact of the facility to serve that particular activity. What is the impact of that facility on the environment? Because skateboarding, we're not talking about skateboarding. We're talking about the building of the skateboard park and the impact on the environment. And that is ultimately what we're really measuring. We're not measuring the activity. And I think that that's really, a really tough question. And this is where the community gets stuck, because even as we look at what does it cost to build a mile of bike trail, and if you bike, you think everybody bikes, but I bike, and what I know is nobody bikes, right? and so we're spending $1 million a mile for some, that's close, which is really startling, right? And a skateboard park, will take up some amount of land, costs significantly less than $1 million, and we are against it. Now, I'm not for skateboard parks. Don't get me wrong, but I think that we have to, that's something that we're juggling, and I don't really know my way around it right now as I kind of talk to people who skateboard, because what's happening is that there's a taste for it. They are building a significant story around youth development and connection to community. I mean, they have done a really good job of building their story to challenge this idea that a skateboard park, one, is going to have a detrimental impact on the environment, and that skateboarding is a problem and skateboarders are a problem. That's really what they have kind of worked through. So as we kind of look at regional parks, I think it is fair for us to really get, drill down and really talk about what it is we're talking about, is that we believe that the development of this facility, this structure, will have a detrimental impact on the environment that we're in. And if that is a real answer, then we can kind of get down to that. Now, we're not going to motorized something different, right? Because now, not just the trail, but the thing itself. So go ahead, Tony.
That's his call. But
Commissioner Uso, go ahead.
I actually want to disagree with half of that.
Okay.
In that, I think it's not just about the environmental impact, but also the environmental connection. So if an activity is not tied to the natural resource existence in some way, even if the facilities that would support it have zero environmental impact,
we wouldn't do it.
I would say that's not appropriate for in a regional park. You can go ahead and build it somewhere,
okay,
but whether it's appropriate in the regional system, we've historically always strongly said it has to be somehow connected to the existence of the natural resource. So it's both meeting the activity being tied to the natural resource and the activity plus facility not damaging it too much.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think either can exist on its own. We have to, so even if we were saying, yes, the impact is acceptable, is it tied to the natural resources?
Is that a standard around activity, that this idea of being tied to the natural resource, that is a standard that we agree on, that is, meaning, because if that is something that we agree on is important, and we can talk to the community specifically with that language in mind as we actually engage them, which I think is the other thing that feels frustrating to community members, is I think that we invite them into the conversation like there's a blank slate. Right? Like that's part of the challenge. And so rather than laying down very clearly what the criteria are for this, as you begin to imagine this, here are the criteria very specifically and very clearly, and that we keep the community from imagining something for itself that is not a possibility. Because I think those are the things that I see within this conversation as we look at some of these activities. So
I agree with you, and I think too there's an issue that you raised earlier about local interest and regional interest, and I think just by nature a local constituency has sentiments about a regional asset that may or may not be entirely aligned with the regional aspiration or interest for that same asset. Councilmember Dorfman, did you
Go
have
ahead, Commissioner. Okay.
So I just have a quick question just to follow up. I'm trying to understand this. You all know more about this than I do. So there's a fair amount of paved property already in our regional system. I'm not sure how that ties to the natural resource, but so just using the skate park analogy, if you built a skate park in a regional park in part of a parking lot that already existed, then you're not impacting the natural resource, but that's still not allowed according to this criteria.
Right. Yeah,
Right?
I think with the way we've been interpreting things historically, it's been is the kind of the pavement is supporting some sort of an interaction with nature. So, for instance, if you've got a paved bike trail, you're observing scenery and wildlife and things as you travel through it. Parking lots are so that you can get there and then access the other things. Whereas in that, yes, it's a gray area. And then when you're talking about putting a skate park there, you're potentially staying within the paved area, so it doesn't have an interaction ultimately. And yes, it's very fuzzy, and that's why we've struggled with this historically.
I just
Commissioner
wanted,
Fleming.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that those who have done more research than me say that there is no legal exclusion of activities with the park, and that there is no specific policy. Now, I'm only speaking from what folks have told me. So, for the most part, they believe that this is just based on personal preference, that there are no legal guidelines that preclude any specific activities within the park. So maybe you can speak to that, because I don't have all of the details. So it's all based on your interpretation, and that's why the public is not necessarily in favor of your interpretation.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if our staff might have a comment on that issue.
Commissioners and committee members, the current Parks Policy Plan, which is our policy guiding document, says that the park implementing agencies can propose activities that may be new to the regional park system, and it's the Metropolitan Council that would approve those new activities. That's the way the current 2015 approved plan reads.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There's a couple of state statutes that define what the regional park system is. Unfortunately, in the online version of the Parks Policy Plan, when I poke at them, it doesn't take, it's highlighted like it's a link, but it doesn't take me to the actual statute. But functionally, regional parks are like state parks. And state parks typically don't have city park amenities in them. I mean, there's kind of a division of labor there. You each do that. I have nothing against skateboard parks whatsoever. I think they're great. But most of the skateboard parks are in city parks, and you get that weird gray area with Minneapolis and St. Paul because they have both kinds of parks. You know, there's always that opportunity to put those skate parks in the city parks that belong to those entities. Just like cities, you know, Burnsville had a city park for a very long time, and some other cities have put them in. Other cities talk about it, and they get the same lobbying from the skateboarding people about we want this. I on the Lakeville City Council, it's just a matter of coming up with the money. Any city can put one in if they want to spend money. The question is, should regional dollars pay for those, or is that more of a city park amenity? Fields and whatnot.
Yes, Commissioner Muller.
I was just rereading the lead-in paragraph to this section, and the one that I think has guided this for some time, which basically says the above criteria provide a framework to ensure that the regional park system can remain responsive to changing recreational needs while protecting the underlying character of each unit's natural environment. So I think that the sense that the natural environment is a key and important part of the regional park system, and that we aren't trying to be a city park with all of those kind of amenities, but rather an organization that looks at new opportunities as they're coming along with the evolution of our population, still preserving the natural characteristics of a regional park. At least that's my interpretation.
Thank you. Yes, Commissioner Tyson.
But the question still comes up, a skate park, a children's playground area, those are all separate. They aren't part of the natural system. I mean, you really have to acknowledge that, as well as any of the other activities. So, when you say they fit or they meld together or they're consistent with the original principles, yeah, maybe. Just depends upon how you're defining that whole piece. I mean, there's another piece we haven't talked about that's become more common and certainly controversial, and that's biking, not ATVs, but the biking that occurs that people call mountain biking, etc. That's certainly, I think Elm Creek Park Preserve has an area like that, but there's pressure to have more of those. And so the question then becomes, is that consistent? Are they consistent? And the definition then becomes a question of what's consistency mean. You could argue that none of these are consistent. I mean, the only way you really be consistent is to keep it totally pristine with dirt trails and no paved. But I mean, that's not what we're looking at.
Yes, Commissioner.
Thank you, Chair. I keep going back to snowmobiling. Page 92, sentence, paragraph 5, when they give the list of snowmobiling in some cases. So there are regional parks out there that allow snowmobiling, and that local entities that provide that ability, they came to a conclusion, they came to a consensus, they got input from their constituents, and they found that in this case we can have a snowmobiling allowed in our regional park. If I may, I'll just transpose that idea to skate park. If you have a community that has no other resources or no other place to put it, the population in that area that wants it, it goes through the vetting process, the majority wishes it, then maybe that could be considered in some case. I don't know, it seems to be that allows the local and the people that want something a chance to have a say in their future. Just an idea.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Uso.
A clarification on the snowmobiling piece. There's stuff about having that be allowed in there, but in terms of the comparison to golf courses, I'm not sure that we fund it. I think all the snowmobile grooming and maintenance might be coming through the grant and aid program instead. Mm-hmm. Is that accurate?
Yes.
So it's the similar kind of exception of it can be in the
So
park.
let me amend my comment a little bit. Going back to the original idea, maybe I jumped ahead in my thinking. Obviously, if the community wants it, it's going to be on their dime. That would be a fair compromise, I would believe.
Councilmember Chavez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One thing for us to consider among the 47 other things we're trying to juggle right at the moment is to separate the money from the use. If you said, okay, we've got a deep pocket for snowmobiling, my bias would come out in spades, and I would say, I will fight you to the Supreme Court on that. Because it's inconsistent in my bias with the use. I would take the same thing with, you could argue, take any use and you could argue that. So I think if we be careful about combining the subjects of money and use, because some deep pocket can always come along and say, well, I want to cover that cost. You're back to the problem of, is it compatible?
Reed, yes.
Yeah, I was going to speak to
Hippis.
that same point that, some of those activities, I think were kind of grandfathered in, like the baseball fields and tennis courts and things like that. But just because they're funded separately, I don't think that they're a legitimate use of the regional park. And while those might be maintained because they're grandfathered in, I think a new use that isn't compatible, even if it has funding from outside sources, should not be allowed. So is that the case? I mean, I'm assuming that that's not the case, that new uses are not being allowed, even if they have funding from other sources.
Mr. Chair?
Councilmember Chavez.
Thank you. That just triggered something else that Wendy may know this, but one of the two parks that I really visit, the other one is Spring Lake, and that's in Wendy's district. But if you think about it there, what I was going to throw out as some weird hypothetical for us is, okay, new use, not even on the radar map. What about a drone park? What use would what principles would justify that? The concrete example we have at Spring Lake Park is a model airfield. However, it's at the edge of the regional park, or not the park itself, not the regional park, but so that use doesn't seem to interfere with the core use that's quiet or visually interfering. So I don't have heartburn about that, but there might be somebody who does. So I really want to direct us towards what's going to really drive the use that's compatible. What type of go back to these crazy things. When the guys develop this, they have user experience workshops and say, what experience do you want to have with this? They don't talk about what's in it. They want to talk about what the user experience is. So if we come back to our principles, are we driving the user experience to be silence, no lights, no pavement, whatever the list is? That is going to rule out various uses along the way. Don't focus on the use. Don't focus on the money. Focus on the experience. What outcomes are we shooting for here? And then to what extent are we willing to allow that authority to reside locally versus regionally? And if you solve that in 5 minutes, then you can go home.
Well, your point is well taken on that last comment, because it's already 10 after 5 and we've spent significant time on this urgent and complicated set of questions. We're not the first ones to do that, right? We're the only ones. I'm wondering a little bit, given that I think there's been a lot of legitimate and interesting dialogue raised here, but I don't know that we're getting necessarily noticeably closer to answering these questions, so to speak. I wonder about the possibility of, some self-selecting participation in a group to do some further work on this in the immediate term, and wondering about the viability of doing that for incorporation into this round of the Regional Parks Policy Plan. I don't want to create delays or create an unnecessary, convening, et cetera. At the same time, this is a set of questions that I think have been all of our minds, really throughout this whole process, and it does seem like they remain really live questions. And I think it would be in order to, from this group, have some focused further conversation if that meets committee members' interests.
That'd be fine with me. Do you have a particular proposal on how to do that? Are you thinking things by email or a future meeting, or?
I'm completely, I don't have a disposition about that. I think, it's most productive probably to get together in a smaller group and try to focus the conversation. Councilmember Wolf.
There's a lot of things that we would have liked to have in this parks policy plan done and figured out, but there's been also major staffing changes over the last couple of years in parks, so a lot of the things fell by the wayside. This may end up being one of those ones that there isn't time to solve because there's so many people that care about the outcome of this. I mean, the park agencies, of course, are very interested, but citizens and everything. And having the breadth of input to really solve this question under the time frame that we have left is unlikely, so that may be one that has to be kicked down the road to the next update.
So one avenue maybe would be to incorporate some specific language articulating that priority as an action step for the term of this plan. Does that seem appropriate to you, Councilmember?
Not having had a red line version, which has been something that's been brought up a few times with this plan, I can't say with any confidence with the difference between this draft and the previous one to say whether there's been enough changes to recognize or if it needs to be changed in the future. Apparently, we're going to be getting one from what I heard at some point, but I can't say.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, it was
Commissioner.
my understanding when we started on this process, this updating of the 2040 Thrive, that it was going to be limited in scope. Now, I hate to use that given the current political climate, but nonetheless, it was my understanding that there was a fairly limited amount of time and focus that would be placed on this particular update. It was not going to be a redo of the thorough page by page, line item by line item that we went through in the 2040 Thrive program. And so I just referenced that in terms of where we're going, that I think we didn't attempt to redo and go back and hash out all of the pieces that we did in rather assertive detail when we came to agreement on the current 2040 plan. So I would defer to staff to discuss with us where they were headed with the process so that we at least know, are we on the main track? If we go back and start redoing, if you will, the 2040 plan, I think it's going to take a good bit more effort than I think we have time for.
Point is well taken. I think.
Mr. Chair, may I add?
Go ahead, Lisa.
The existing language that's in the draft, kind of looking at the criteria that's on the page, bottom of page 91 and onto page 92, and then following in the next 2 pages, is pretty detailed in its discussion, and is substantially similar to what's in our existing adopted 2040 Regional Parks Policy Plan. You can see at the end of this section, the bottom of page 93 and following under 94, that the language states that the initial decision as to whether a new activity can and should be accommodated is determined by the Regional Park Implementing Agency. And then the council will become involved if the Regional Parks Implementing Agency decides it would like to accommodate a new activity that the council deems the use incompatible with a nature-based system or finds that a master plan amendment is necessary. So this is the process we've been using to review activities that aren't already on our list. It's a process then that would come through to, if there is a change to the master plan for that particular facility, that then would come before the MPOSC and then the CDC to review whether or not that indeed is a compatible use before it could move forward. So it doesn't necessarily end with the policy plan itself, but right now the language leaves that open, that possibility and determination open, and that process open for continued dialogue. I don't know if that helps, but I wanted to make sure that everybody had that as their baseline for understanding how the changes to master plans occur and how these uses come forward.
And
Commissioner.
on what you were saying with the timelines and things, this may very well be something where I'm thinking, we all have limited terms that we serve, and knowing where we're going in the future would be useful. So it might be that staff use whatever language we do have agreement on, but then in this and probably on several of our other things, include some language about what people need to be thinking about next time the plan is updated to give us a way to kick that off, rather than feeling like we're starting from scratch every time.
I think that's a great bit of direction.
Question.
Member Dorfman.
Mr. Mueller said, not this most recent, but his statement before, if I heard you correctly, that we want a plan that has evolved to reflect the changing population of our region too. And so, which I think gets at a lot of this discussion, because obviously our region has changed significantly since these activities were developed in the late 1960s, even if they were reviewed more recently. Does that process, which sounds a little cumbersome to me, but processes usually are, does it allow us to reflect, to, to bring forward changes that reflect the quickly changing population of our region and what people are looking for in the regional park system?
Sure, Councilmember, Mr. Chair, Councilmember Dorfman. You know, we see these being generated from our regional parks agencies, so we would kind of look to them being closest to the people on what those uses are going to be, what demand they're hearing, and seeing that in the master plans that they're bringing forward. And that's where the application of those criteria that are listed on page 91 would come into play too. This is a different activity. Does this meet these criteria? Are impacts to the natural environment minimized? So it isn't necessarily prescriptive. I think what on page 92 is listed are uses that have always been allowed. These are the base uses. And then the rest of the discussion is, and other uses could be accommodated given these things, with additional discussion about what conflicting activities might evolve around them, especially involving motorized activity. But I think it leaves it open at this point. And I think the direction we'd be looking for from this body is, do you want us to be more specific in this draft about does this language meet that? Do the criteria meet those principles that Councilmember Chavez had identified early on? Are those descriptive enough to be able to respond to changing demographic needs? Or are we looking at, or is there something else that this body would like to have included in there to reflect other principles that are not on this list on the bottom of page 91, or to make sure that we can be more responsive to some of these ideas that have been discussed today?
And I think, given Commissioner Urosso's comment, I think, which is really a good one about given time frame, et cetera, I think it's probably judicious to think about incorporating a specific statement about this being something that needs further attention in the coming cycle. Other things being equal, it would be my preference to dive into that, but that's my own weak point, perhaps. I think, given the schedule, et cetera, it probably is a larger undertaking and requires convening of a larger group of stakeholders than is realistic in that time frame.
And we should warn that of the few themes we had talking today, we did put one of the harder ones at the end. So we should probably
I agree. I think if committee members are open to it, I think we should proceed.
Great. Thank you. This issue, the second one, is actually closely related to your discussion that you just had. So I think that you're well suited to jump right in. Let me just very quickly say, so what does the plan say about natural resources? The background, Chapter 2, calls for the regional park system to provide a comprehensive regional park and trail system that balances the conservation and restoration of natural resources with the provision of nature-based recreational opportunities. Chapter 5 outlines that master plans must include a plan for the natural resource management. Chapter 7 calls for balancing conservation and recreation, what we just were discussing. And finally, Chapter 8 describes funding priorities for the Parks and Trails Legacy Plan. So that's what the plan says. Comments that we heard get at this tension between natural resources and development. The first comment from Thomas Hazen, a St. Paul resident, says, "We would like to see the legacy funds used for more conservation of natural areas and less for bricks and blacktop. Nature should be supported for its own existence. Currently, too much money is being spent to accommodate humans to the detriment of nature." Another comment, and this was actually a spoken comment during the CDC public hearing we had at your last meeting from Emmanuel Ortiz, a Minneapolis resident and also a Parks and Power person from Minneapolis, again, an organization. The region's shifting demographics suggest re-examining the types of activities allowed in the regional park system. All active recreation is being pushed into local parks. Look for opportunities to provide for active recreation in the regional park system. I'm going to now cover 3 more comments that get at this tension between natural resources and development. This first one is from, this is an email address. There wasn't a name, Pewter1 of 6. He's a resident of the region. I read with dismay the plans to expand new construction of infrastructure and adding more asphalt with chemical treatments throughout our park system. Why can't wild stay wild? Jeff Strait, resident of the region, this draft of the plan would enable expanded development in the park system that would arguably marginalize and degrade the system's natural green infrastructure. Now Michael Torres, also a resident. The Metropolitan Council should consider more bike facilities, bike skill parks, and off-road trails to augment current regional parks and help with their interconnectedness. So those were 3 comments. This gets right to the language. So this is, the first one is from the 2015 plan as adopted. And this is Chapter 7, Strategy 1, which you just discussed. Activities in regional parks must be tied to the natural resources of the parks, but not adversely impact them. The 2018 plan as drafted says activities in regional parks should balance the conservation and restoration of natural resources with the provision of recreational opportunities. I want to just add that one of the criteria on page 91 does get at that avoid or minimize adverse environmental effects, but it was pulled out of the strategy language and into the criteria. So the question is, what should the 2018 plan say? And that leads me to your discussion question, which is, how should the plan balance natural resources and development in regional parks?
Thank you for that, Commissioner Urusso.
There are 2 things that jumped out at me that I want to draw out here. One is we had, there's a continuum of comments. Some on one end of that is suggesting that our regional parks should just be undeveloped open space, primarily as habitat, natural plant life, and things like that. And I do want to point out that in terms of our statutory requirement, you mentioned when looking at the languages of the statutes, it's specifically about regional recreation open space. So to whatever extent recreation can occur there. So it is calling for some level of development that supports the recreation, which is again how we talked about tied to the natural resource. So there are some things that are low impact, like hiking on an unpaved trail, and things like that. But knowing that we're looking somewhere in the middle, the one end where it's not developed for recreation is not our statutory direction. And then the other thing is several of the comments on this theme talk specifically about the legacy amendment. And I think we do a poor job of describing exactly what that is because only a very small piece of it is subject to our policy. When you look at the way the legacy amendment is written, how those pots of money are divided up, there's 4 different funds that they go to. 66% of it is natural resource conservation, split evenly between water and everything else land-based. And then 14.25% is the part that we actually have jurisdiction over. Our plan only talks about that little piece because it's all we actually do anything with. But I think it would be useful to remind people that when we're dealing with legacy funds, there's 4 times as much money than that being spent just on natural resource preservation stuff. So even if we don't control that money, we should call out that it is being used in the regional system because it's for state and regional significance. So it does come to us just through a different review body, and we should recognize that in the plan.
That's a great point. Thank you. Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to pile on that one because that's been bugging me for a while. You said it better than I would have, but um, in large part, that money has not been coming to the metro area, even though we have degraded natural resources as well. And so a lot of the habitat restoration has been going on with other money that the park agencies have of their own money from taxes and whatnot. But I think it's important to recognize that a lot of times you can't do the natural resources restoration unless you're doing development. I mean, we saw that with Cottage Grove Ravine Regional Park. They wanted to put basically a big storm drain through, storm water path through the park, which at first sounded horrible, but staff worked on it with the county, with Washington County for probably 5 years, and worked out a way to accommodate the stormwater runoff and do natural resources protection. They're getting rid of buckthorn. They've got goats in the park doing all of that. And then they've dealt with some erosion issues and public access. And it all comes together as a package. You're not going to get the natural resources restoration if you're not doing anything else in the park. Some of our agencies have applied for legacy money, and a few of them have gotten it. I'm geeky enough that I was looking through the list over the weekend. I didn't get through all of it, but I saw a few places where regional park agencies had put in for money. But the vast majority of that natural resource restoration money is going to greater Minnesota, even though we do have that need here in the region. And I want to make sure that people understand the difference between those pots of money and that we're doing what we're told, just like you said.
So it might even be worth having something call out that we encourage our implementing agencies to be applying for those grants, and we should be supplying whatever support we need to get them. Because yeah, that's true. There has been a disproportionate allocation of them, even though these are the ones in the metro that are supposed to be eligible.
Councilmember Dorfman.
Can I ask a question, if I might, about this changed language? So the new language that activities in regional parks should balance the conservation and restoration of natural resources with the provision of recreational opportunities. Well, we received a comment from somebody who said that ultimately what this says, this new language, is that an activity must conserve or restore natural resources in order to be permitted. And I don't read it that way. And so I'm wondering.
Councilmember Dorfman, chairs, I don't read it that way either. Excuse me.
Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The intent in changing the language was to word it basically what we've been doing all along, because you can't have no adverse impact, but because that was brought up as well, that we shouldn't be able to have any trails.
Right.
So we're acknowledging the level of activity that is inherent in the park system and the importance of natural resources. It's not giving anybody a license to do anything any different from what we've been doing thus far. It's just wording it to be more general public understandable on what we already do.
Appreciate that. That was also my interpretation, at least. I also thought that the 2018 draft seems to provide more room for the significant imperative that we have around meeting the ADA as well. Councilmember Munn.
Mr. Chair, I have been quiet today because I'm struggling between my role as a policymaker and my role in my own community. I'm going to share with you what's happening in my own community and the lesson that I'm learning from it. First of all, my lesson in Minnetonka, you've read about the controversy about introducing mountain biking to Lone Lake Park. Our city, I think, is struggling to make every park be everything to everyone. And I think we can learn from that. My experience with regional parks is each park has a unique flavor, and it becomes a destination to people because it is unique. What happened in Minnetonka Jeff Strait was the commenter who said he was concerned about degrading our natural green environment. Jeff and I were there when we paved trails so that people in wheelchairs could roll through the park. We were there when they turned the tennis courts into pickleball courts so that older people could use the park. We were there when we introduced soccer and basketball and a children's playground. But we're not there when they want to introduce the mountain bikes, because too much is too much. For us in Minnetonka, there are so many people who use the park. I went there on a Friday afternoon. I talked to 97 people. I actually counted the way our staff do. And when I talked to people, they said, our lives are so hectic, we need a place where we can come and just enjoy nature. We need a place where we can walk through trails at the same time that we're preserving our ecosystem. And at some point, the word balance matters. And at some point, too much is too much. I feel strongly that we need to talk to the people who live near our parks to find out how those demographics are changing and what their desires are. But we also have to think of our parks being unique and being destinations for people all over the metro. I learned that through my union. My day job used to be with AFSCME, and we would have an annual picnic at different regional parks. And when we would have a picnic at Battle Creek, all the folks from Hennepin County would come there the first time. When they enjoyed the splash pad and the water park, that became a destination. Same thing for folks from Ramsey County. When they came to French Lake Regional Park, they discovered the unique parts of that park and would come. I think we have an obligation to make sure people know that our parks are there and that they know the differences and that they're welcome to be there. So my lesson from Minnetonka, a park can't be everything to everyone.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Councilmember Elkins.
Thank you. I mean, I'll weigh in on this one as well. I think a lot of the specific cases that have been brought forward recently that, demonstrate this particular tension, have had elements of, the desire to preserve nature for nature's sake versus the legal requirement to provide access to disabled communities. That I think we understand that we do have an obligation, both moral and legal, to provide that access, and sometimes that is going to trump the desire to keep a place, quote unquote, pristine.
Mm-hmm. For that. So I think, yes, Commissioner.
I just wanted to say, page 91 of the last bullet point, I would hope that someone would add age, because preteens and teens are not using the parks, at least in the area that I'm representing. So I would like to see that added, please.
Yeah, I believe we made that edit on another page somewhere in it, but I haven't gone through and looked for all the places that might have been omitted. So I remember we had a mention of that at one of our meetings.
Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would suggest that in general, where there are things that have been sort of quoted from Thrive in the policy plan, if they've been changed from something different from Thrive language, to just go back to the Thrive language, wherever it happens in the plan, just to be consistent between our plans, because Thrive calls out what sorts of accommodate or subgroups to accommodate, or whatever is in there. We should kind of use the same thing, would be my suggestion.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. What I'm hearing generally is support for this 2018 draft language on this point. Is that consistent with what committee members are feeling? Okay.
Yes.
I'm seeing yes. Councilmember Wolf?
Assuming that we've gotten to yes on that and we're going on to the next thing, maybe since we're taking so long to get through this stuff, when we come to the slide about comments from the public, maybe you could just leave that slide up while we're having the discussion rather than read all of the comments to us.
Point noted.
Okay, let's proceed then.
Thank you. Well, if you like those last two conversations, this one continues a lot of the same themes, but the particular topic is the development of trails, particularly biking trails but really biking and walking all access trails in regional parks. This is a theme, this is an idea that has been around for a while. When we developed Thrive in 2013, 14, 15, the necessity for the Met Council largely to coordinate between regional trails, which are in the regional parks system, and regional bicycle transportation network, which is in our transportation functions. A lot of people pointed out we need to do better coordination of those two systems. That's what this is about. In the plan, we described it generally. This topic appears in a number of places. Chapters 3, 4, and 5 talk about regional trails as recreational opportunities, linear pathways through the metropolitan area. But in Chapter 7 is where it appears the most. Biking is named. It's on that list as an allowable use. It is implicated in Strategy 3, calling for equitable use of parks. Regional trails allow a greater range of people with different mobility to access the resources that are in regional parks. So it falls into a equity category too. And then finally, more particularly to that larger comment, Strategy 4 encourages coordination of bicycle and pedestrian facilities in regional parks. So that's the motivation behind all the comments that we've got as this idea has gone forward. Transportation system, the RBTN, Regional Bike Transportation Network, they prioritize criteria for getting from point A to point B faster and more smoothly. That's what they're looking for when they're looking to invest regional dollars in the transportation network in bike trails. Regional parks has a higher priority on natural systems, the experience of the place, really on what we've been talking about, the focus of the natural environment. The rub here is, when do those two come into conflict? Across all the comments that we've received, there's, on one end of the spectrum, there's really well described by a lot of the comments, what if we put high speed, fast, and I'll out some of my coworkers, lycra clad, aggressive bicyclists going through highly sensitive natural areas where people are doing very calm, passive nature appreciation at a slow speed. That kind of conflict is clearly not what we're going for here, and it's well described in the comments that you'll read. It also, that sort of conflict also has a problem not just for the experience of the parks, but also for the wildlife and nature resources that are in there, and has a real danger, particularly of fragmenting ecosystems that are in especially some of our larger, more pristine parks. So folks are very concerned and very well sort of spoken about that. On the other end of the spectrum, we also have an obligation to establish a safe place for all people to experience the parks. And in this case, we're talking about riding, but it would also include walking and everything else. So we do have to protect nature. We also have to provide access. And here we are at the middle of it. I will not read the comments, but I'll just say the one on the left emphasizes the natural systems. The one on the far right comments on the transportation systems in a negative comment. And the one in the middle sort of has sort of in between. One last observation I'll make before the discussion question is this also varies by the location in the metro. There are a lot of regional parks in Minneapolis, St. Paul, in the immediately surrounding suburbs, where there's been a longstanding commute pattern through those regional parks. There are a lot of parks further out from the center that are more pristine natural areas. And so we have a lot of comments. If you page through the comment report, think about how those comments are based in someone's personal experience. It does tend to organize itself geographically. Currently, we essentially ask the implementing agencies to coordinate and to balance those things against each other. The question for today, for you guys, is should we do more in the Parks Policy Plan to talk about balancing trails development and protecting natural resources?
Thank you, Dan. Councilmember Elkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I'll say that I was probably the instigator for Policy 4, but part of that was practical. So we are able to fund trails through two different funding streams. One is the Transportation Advisory Board process, which is more transportation oriented, and then we have our parks and trails funding sources. But I was seeing that that there are a number of cases where a particular trail is serving both purposes, and so we needed to provide some clarity between, just to indicate to grant applicants whether they should be applying for a particular trail's funding through our parks and recreation funding sources versus our transportation sources. And so one of my practical objectives in this is just to clarify those guidelines about, depending on what is the primary purpose of your trail, which funding source should you be applying funding for. So the other observation that I would make, and I think Commissioner Taylor may want to chime in on this one as well, but I've not been biking as much this year as usual, but I'm a bike to work commuter and for several days a week when I'm able, and an avid recreational rider as well. And what I find is that there's actually not a big difference between my riding habits when I'm commuting and when I'm recreating. I use an application called Map My Ride to track my biking, and it tells me split speeds. And what I generally find is that when I'm on a recreational ride through a regional park, I'm usually traveling somewhere between 12 and 14 miles per hour. Sometimes when I'm on a commute on the road, especially if it's long and straight and downhill, I'll average maybe 14 to 16 miles per hour on those rides. But it's not a big difference. And if you look at the MnDOT guidelines on trail designs, they don't really differentiate, between those uses. They're trying to create guidelines for what will be safe, especially for multi-use trails. And let's face it, most of the trails that we're talking about, especially within our regional park system, aren't bike trails. They're multi-use trails, and they're there for the use of people who are biking, using other kinds of wheeled vehicles, including wheelchairs and strollers in many cases. And they have to be safe for all of the people who are going to use them. And so the guidelines that are provided by MnDOT and DNR take that into account and provide, say, appropriate widths that are safe, with the knowledge that multiple different kinds of users are going to be using them. But by and large, the design guidelines that primarily MnDOT has promulgated are flexible enough to allow both the transportation agency and a park agency to design their trails in a way that's appropriate for their context.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Other comments on this tension point?
I think it seemed to me that most of it would be a question of what the design was going to be dramatically different, I don't know that that's the case, because we typically haven't gotten into the nitty-gritty of design kinds of things when we're talking about policy. So maybe they're all the same, like you say. I haven't looked at those documents, but I imagine they're probably close. But if if they were different in some way, in some guidelines, we might just call out that the portion that passes through a regional park would match more closely to the park guideline than elsewhere. But in most cases, I think it's more a matter of just putting them on the same map.
I think we did include, I think, in the current draft, there are references to the MnDOT guidelines, which are currently being revised, and we had a good back and forth with the folks who are doing those revisions, and we were able to provide feedback to them as part of their rewrite.
Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it's good to have more discussion between the park folks and the public works folks at the different agencies. That's always helpful. And within the council, having people in those different areas talk together is good. I think at some point in the future, we may want to look at if some of these there's some linking trails that run along the side of a county road. They're not a recreational experience. It's just basically a glorified sidewalk on the side of the county road. At some point, since we do have so many more things in our plate that we can't afford to pay for, it might be worth looking at if some of those less recreational sort of trails should actually be in the regional bike network rather than in the regional trail network. That would probably make the implementing agencies go, but since there are the two networks now and there weren't before, that's maybe something for a future date to discuss. I think overall the plan does an okay job of teasing out those different kinds of uses. What I don't want to do is get in the business of deciding, okay, every regional trail has to be X number of feet wide and this and that and the other thing, because our region is so dramatically different from, Bede-Makaska to Meadsville Ravine. I mean, they're worlds apart in terms of who goes there, what they're trying to do, and all of that, and us micromanaging what the trail standards should be. I don't think we could come up with something that could really accommodate all of the differences within the system.
Commissioner Taylor.
And I don't know, maybe it was Commissioner Chavez earlier talking about user experience. That I think in terms of the trail system, the thing that I am aware of is the experience for someone who's not on a bike right now. And that's something I've been really sensitive to recently in terms of biking. And I think as we talk about standards and we talk about continued development, that's something that I feel like we should begin to think about, because however we get people outside and moving is really important. And I think that right now, because there is a general culture that whoever's moving the biggest and the fastest has the right of way. And that's something else we have to redirect. I don't know how we'll do that. There's a whole nother grant, right? But it really is a challenge where the cyclist that is moving the fastest is irritated at the cyclist that is moving a little slower, that is irritated at the walker, that is irritated at the walker with a stroller, that is irritated with the person. You know what I mean? This kind of thing. And so
forget people with dog leashes.
And people with dog leashes, exactly. But I think from, as the tension between the development of trails and natural and nature, I feel like they're doing a good job of that, actually. I mean, there is some sensitivity to it. There's an awareness of it. So I think that we can state what that is, what the standard is around the impact on the natural environment. The idea of when we talk about the user experience, though, is something else. And specifically, I think about walkers. I think about people that aren't moving as fast. I think about, there's someone in a wheelchair, someone with a stroller. There is something happening on trails because of the connected nature of the trails. They are actually becoming more and more useful for recreational cyclists. I mean, it's very. I just rode yesterday from Nokomis up to Coon Rapids Dam, and it was almost all trails, with some street trails, right? And it was. It's a lot of trail system, and it was wonderful. And there were sections that were super windy that slow you down because they have tried to have a minimum impact on the environment with tree removal, with following water lines and those kind of things. So. I think the tension between the trails and the impact on nature is something that I feel like that we are aware of and not as aware of the impact on user experience.
Mr. Fleming, I know you had your hand up earlier.
No, I was just gonna ask a basic question, and maybe everyone else knows. Is there a prime directive, or what's driving all of these trails? I mean, what's going on? Public outcry? I mean, people are tramping through on foot. I mean, why are we doing all of the trails?
Our staff want to address that question?
The regional trails that we have in the system are the ones that our regional park implementing agencies, their locally elected boards, have identified as projects that they want to pursue. We have a goal in the regional park system to link up all of our regional parks and park reserves. That's sort of a loose goal, idea of like an emerald necklace idea, but it's really up to the regional park implementing agencies to propose what trails exist. We certainly have a responsibility for any system additions the council ultimately approves.
So there's no requirement that you have to have at least 20 people going through or whatever in order for it to be developed as a trail? Or is it just more trails? That's all we care about.
I think that there is, Commissioner Fleming and committee members, there is a standard for how, when a trail is needed. That said, the proposal of a new trail is something that is driven at the implementing agency, that unit level. Did that answer your question, or should Wendy clarify?
If she knows why everybody wants more trails.
I can't answer why. I mean, I like trails. I can't answer why everybody wants more trails, but not everybody does. But I just wanted to make sure that the rules that we had in place before about you had to have so much space between different regional trails are still in here with the reordering of everything.
Commissioner Moeller.
Mr. Chairman, two comments. One is that in the area where I come from, the city people and the regional people say to me, the number one amenity that our people want with taxpayer dollars is more trails. They find that the most useful and most valuable amenity in our area. Number two, the conversation of Commissioner Taylor just brings to mind that I think one of our responsibilities, MPOSC, is to stress the need for safe design for the various users of our trails, be they aged or young, strollers or wheeled or whatever, that somehow we reinforce the need for safety, whether that be signage or I don't know what. I'm only saying the implementing agencies have that responsibility of design. I think one of our responsibilities should be to make sure in the master plan process we are asking at least the question, how are you addressing the issue of safe usage of your trails?
Point well taken. Councilmember Elkins.
To add on to that kind of, one of the points I'd like to make is that, we've had several, trail projects that have been brought to us as examples of, perhaps excessive design in terms of impact on the environment. But it seems like every one that I've kind of drilled into, it really wasn't the needs of bicyclists that were driving the design so much. It was the requirements of the Americans with Disabilities Act in terms of grades on trails.
It's helpful. I think, generally speaking, I feel like I'm hearing agreement in general on this topic. It feels like people have a pretty similar orientation to this particular tension point. Is that specific enough direction for staff on this specific piece?
Chairs Comer and DiRusso, I think so, yes. We're also and a cross-reference with the discussion of protection of natural systems that
Mhm.
was in earlier discussion. And that's what we'll work from. Thank you. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Committee members, it is 6 o'clock, and I want to be respectful of your time. At the same time, we're all here together, and what I would like to suggest in conjunction with Commissioner Uruso is that we proceed to the fifth topic, equity toolkit use and project prioritization. I think it's really critical that we have some conversation about that, and then we're able to give staff some feedback and direction on that. What I would propose is that we set a hard stop of 6:30 to our meeting, including that topic. I realize not all of us will be able to stay, perhaps, through that conversation, and I regret that. I'm sorry. I take responsibility for the fact that we're in a time-constrained situation, but at the same time, these are all pretty important topics, and we'll do the best that we can. So let's proceed to that topic if we could.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this final piece is looking at the question of the use of the equity toolkit, and specifically boiling it down to whether or not the plan should say that the Parks Commission and the Council may reprioritize projects, queuing up for bonding funding or other non-legacy funding as a result of the use of the equity toolkit. So that's really the language that we're looking at. So what is before you is simply the language that is in the plan that was put out for public comment. So to say that the Commission and the Council may shift the order of the prioritized list of capital projects. So inside of this, we did get a range of comments on this. On the left, which I will not read, is a sample of a comment that came from one of the regional parks implementing agencies. We did receive comments from 8 of the 10 regional park implementing agencies, and all 8 did make similar comments expressing concern about the language allowing for reprioritization. There was also a comment regarding reprioritization in the comment letter that is in the packet from Metropolitan Parks and Open Space Commission. We also received a range of comments both from organizations and from individuals, represented by the comment on the right, expressing support for reprioritization remaining in the plan as an example of maintaining and strengthening the language in the plan around equity. I went through all of the comments and flagged the various pieces that the use of the equity toolkit came up in the comments that we received. This includes both the implementing agencies as well as individual comments. Some of the specific comments, most notably from the Ramsey County Parks and Recreation Commission. So this is the Resident Advisory Commission working with Ramsey County. The West Side Citizens Organization called out reprioritization specifically. Many more of the comments were really around encouraging the council and MPOSC as well to maintain and strengthen the overall commitment to equity without having specific comments about prioritization or reprioritization, but more a continued interest in advancing equity overall. So a specific example of this is that there's kind of this third voice in the comments, that there are really 2 voices that came up that expressed continued interest and support for the use of the equity toolkit and concern about using project reprioritization moving forward. So there are a range of voices on this topic, and this is one that staff is particularly interested in guidance on how to move forward on this issue.
Thank you, Libby, for teeing that up for us. Councilmember Munn.
Mr. Chair, just as we are advised by MPOSC, we're also advised by an equity advisory committee that helps the council put an equity lens on all the decisions that we make. And I'd just like to share with you their recommendations briefly. 4 things that stood out for them to prioritize. First, engaging people of color and indigenous peoples in using the parks. Second, hiring diverse staff who reflect the diverse makeup of our region to make our parks more welcoming. Third, identifying and mitigating barriers to people of color and indigenous people using parks and trails. That's about talking to people, not those who are currently using our parks, but those who aren't, to discover what are the barriers that prevent them from using parks and trails. And fourth, making the regional parks more accessible for people with disabilities. They also added 2 more advisory notes. The first is to support the creation of the Equity Grant Program, and they'd like to be active participants in forming those guidelines. And secondly, they support maintaining and strengthening the language that says that the toolkit may be used on occasion to reprioritize the list of capital projects as submitted by the agencies for state and regional bonds and other funding sources as appropriate and allowable.
Thank you for that. It's a helpful review of their position on these pretty important questions. Councilmember Barber.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have concerns, and I've voiced them at earlier meetings, at both our council meeting and I think earlier CDC meeting, about changing the language from what the version that was adopted by MPAS on July 12th regarding reprioritization, because I think that the language that was added after that takes us beyond what our scope is as a entity. I believe that the state bonding really is determined by the state legislature, and I think us reprioritizing projects based off of what's coming from implementing agencies to put those recommendations, it takes our role a step too far. So I very strongly advocate that we go back to the earlier language. I do think it does accomplish the purpose overall, and I think it supports still supports our belief in equity and how that works with the regional park system and our policies behind it, but also make sure that we are using our role properly in that.
Thank you. Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've also been pretty forceful in my opinion on that change. I would just point out that at our last MPOS meeting, we were just reviewing the legacy money, not reprioritizing anything, but just reviewing the equity toolkit stuff on the legacy money. And it took just giving each agency 10 minutes to give us a quick overview of 2 years worth of spending. That took 1 hour and 40 minutes. And these things are on such tight timelines, we don't have time to have multiple meetings over 4 months period to work on possible reprioritization of the projects. The agencies, when we are doing their capital stuff, because this is separate from legacy, we've already lost the ability to reprioritize legacy, but on the bonding money, the agencies are still working on their capital improvement plans as we're reviewing this stuff, because the legislature wants it in advance of the legislative session, even though they're going to sit on it until May. We have to turn it in the fall. And so we have one, maybe 2 meetings to whip through 10 different agencies. And all it does is make it look like the agencies are doing a bad job. And my feeling from looking through the legacy stuff that they came through, they're doing a great job on their plans. They've got nothing that we should be telling them to do differently. Plus, the projects that come forward, the agencies can do however many projects they want within their chunk of money that's in the formula. That might be 1 project, it might be 10 projects, but they decide what projects go into that. It's not like you can say, oh, you know what? You put all of your money into these 5 projects and we want you to do that other project on the other side of town because we don't think your distribution is equitable. So it's kind of poking the bear for just to get bit and not get anything in return, basically.
I had a comment.
Mr. Fleming.
Yeah, I just think it's a sad commentary that we can't treat you equitably because it's too time consuming. So I would hate to think that we're telling people that or sending a message. And equity has been an issue in Minnesota. I mean, I don't have to quote all of the studies that have been done, and it's been intentional. To say agencies have been doing okay is a fallacy because they've not been doing okay. So, yes, I think not only do we need this language, but we should take out the words on occasion. In every instance that we should apply equity. So not uh, willy-nilly, but always.
Thank you. Commissioner Urso.
I feel like it would be helpful to give a little bit of background on kind of where MPOS came from, because this is the sort of thing that doesn't necessarily come through well in meeting minutes. But this is something that we've, of course, been struggling with for 5 years now, where we got the direction from Thrive of, hey, equity is a concern. What do we do about it? So there's always been agreement among MPOS that we want to be serious about addressing equity, but very little agreement or even necessarily understanding of how do we do that. Not all of us have a great background in that, and we're limited in what we can do. We have a very particular role in this system and limited both legal and moral authority of what we can and can't do. So we've been trying to find what we can do and how that's effective. So when we came up with the previous plan, talks in 2014, 2015, the idea that came out then was we can use this for reprioritizing projects if we need to. And that was the best idea we had at the time. In the years since, it's become less clear whether that is the most effective path. So that's why it was removed in between those two, not because the commitment to equity is any different, but because we weren't sure whether that was the way to do it, especially because we all are ultimately subject to decisions by the legislature. We did have the one decision removing our authority on one of those. Kind of expected that that could happen on the other pot of money as well. And also our feedback from the implementing agencies of this is actually more complicated than necessarily thought to implement because of the way long-term plans work. So kind of looking at it of maybe there's something else we can do. And when we look at the comments from the Equity Advisory Committee, I think that really calls out one of them, which was 3 years ago we were going to set up a completely separate fund it, and have a competitive grant program, and we failed to do that. So that's on all of us so far. We really need to do that, and that will not address all of the concerns. We had several comments that said one program's not going to do everything, but I think it significantly helps and would make this a lot less heartburny. How we do that, to what extent, is still up in the air, but clearly that needs to be funded. And then in terms of the reprioritization, took that out because we were no longer convinced it was the best way, and we were worried about our relationships with the legislature and our implementing agencies as a result of that. So certainly open to other ideas of what to do, but it feels like just putting that back in wasn't necessarily the best way to go because we weren't seeing it as the right option anymore. So that's where the kind of big disconnect came when there was an amendment, I believe, at the CDC level to turn that language. It's not that we don't want to do equity, it's that we want to find a different way of doing it that might work better for our partners. So looking certainly for advice on what that might be.
Councilmember Barber.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate those comments. I think it makes sense as to how MPOS came back to the language that they originally had. And I do like the idea of approaching things from the equity grant perspective. That's approaching things that way, I think, because all of our implementing agencies are doing things to address equity. They are, just as we are at council, obviously we're still working on things to improve equity in different ways, which is why we have things like the Equity Advisory Committee that are coming on board. And I think that if you have a grant program like that, one of the things I think that if you are locked into certain steps, you're going to just do certain steps, which could happen in a prioritization. If you have a grant program, you might have people who will try something that's outside the box that can actually move the dial a little more on equity than you would if you were following something very strict and regimented.
Commissioner Hibas.
Well, one of the big takeaways that I had with the conversations that we had with the implementing agencies was that, they get funding from different sources. And when when you use something so strict as to say this set needs to be used in a certain way, it really, they have certain projects they want to accomplish. And so if they're using, for example, money from another source for this purpose, it kind of restricts how they can use, because each one of them has their guidelines. And so they need to be able to prioritize their use of their funds based on the guidelines. And so when you double up, for example, two things, then it kind of eliminates the scope that they can maybe have for their entire project. I don't know if I really said that correctly or not, but.
Well, yeah. Thank you. Mr. Mueller.
I basically second Mr. Russo's commentary, but I would just like to say that the opportunity for the equity grant program provides a real way for the Met Council to put its money where its mouth is in terms of sponsoring something which broadly across the region supports and encourages equity usage of our parks. The second point I would make is that our trying to reprioritize the implementing agency's plans is really one that was not particularly workable. We have a limited amount of time and we have a limited amount of knowledge, frankly, as individuals about these 50-some projects which they bring forward. Before they brought them forward, they have been worked through their own park organizations. They have been approved by their board. So they have a number of people reviewing and they have public input before these things are all put together and prioritized. For us to make the decision that says, oh, we think that this one here should be above that one, I believe to be not practical, and just speaking for myself, I don't feel qualified, frankly, to make some of those kind of decisions across the region. So I strongly support the original language that was in our recommendation.
Thank you. Councilmember Chavez?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple of comments, thoughts. This discussion reminds me of the work that I co-chaired on the housing policy plan. And when we delved into the distinction between affordable housing and fair housing, and what is an appropriate role, what is an authorized role, what is a legal role for Met Council in either one of those buckets. And we got into an interesting conversation among council members about that. Bottom line came out that the law says A, and we can't go there. What I feel is going on, the current in here, is that this is another one of those tension points about enforcement versus being creative. And my bias always is avoiding the enforcement path. And if we really want to walk the talk about equity, let's get the money on the table and make it happen one way or the other, rather than talking about, well, we're going to reprioritize or we're going to refocus things. That doesn't move the dial, to be quite honest. So I'm not married to this text about a reprioritization. I'd like to focus more energy about any type of equity grant program analogous to what we have done for a long time on the Livable Communities program. Focus that way. Find some solutions.
Councilmember Elkins.
Thank you. The more I've thought about this one, I think that the trying to guide capital budgets is a rather blunt instrument, and I would rather have us see another source of funding that's not tied to capital, like the interest fund that used to be dedicated to the North Minneapolis River Parks, and take that and use it to have a grant program that would incentivize the creation of programming that would encourage disadvantaged communities to make more use of the park. So the kinds of things that Wilderness Inquiry does, or Commissioner Taylor's Bike Club does, things that actually actively, through active programming, bring underrepresented communities into the parks and create a habit of usage among those communities.
Thank you. Commissioner Taylor.
I think that in this, I've been on impasse since we started working on this project, and so one of the things that I agree with what most recently been said, because my take on it, and I was just sharing that I actually was with DNR this morning looking at issues around their equity initiatives, and one of the things we did was created kind of, in my job, was where's the center of the universe when we talk about equity, and so we just chose Fort Snelling. And we literally looked at the 30-mile radius of where are people, right? And once we looked at the Asian community, Hispanic, Latinx community, we looked at the African-American community, and looked at it in terms of income. And relative to the region, all of it is fundamentally focused around the St. Paul, Richfield, Bloomington, and Minneapolis. So the thing that when we look at equity, the thing for me is I don't want to look at equitable processes anymore. I feel like we're spending a lot of time on process, and in the end, we've got to move the needle. Like at some point, we have to be able to measure usage in the park, and it requires a regional approach. And that's really the big idea, is that when we look at the implementing agencies, sometimes what we wind up with is Washington County's approach to equity. Know what it is? Drive a bus into the city from Washington County and bring some people out to a program and count them, right? That we wind up with those kind of justifications as equity programs, and they're not. If people are not exercising agency and moving the parks for what matters to improving their lives and what's happening for them, then we're not having equitable use of our parks. That's really what we're talking about. So we have to find a way to get to the grant program now. We have to find a way to identify the dollars where we can approach equity from a regional perspective and measure it and move the needle for real. And when we're moving the needle, we should applaud ourselves. And when we're not moving the needle, we have to change our strategies. And right now, our strategy is all focused on how we're going to get implementing agencies to do something that feels like they don't want to do it. But I think when you look inside, I believe there is an intent. I get a chance to work with them, and I believe there is an intent to actually do this. But the tension is not this tension. It is the tension that they're having in their interactions with us around allocation of the funds, and we have to remove that so we can move forward in a unified way towards achieving this goal, and really, and really measure moving the needle. Because I think right now we're just creating a fight. We've got to move forward now.
I appreciate those comments, Commissioner. Maybe on behalf of the CDC, I can just give kind of a perspective about the premise of our essentially retention of the language that was in the previous Parks Plan. And I think for me, it strikes directly to one of the aspects of the role that we play as council members, which is difficult and definitely not our most glamorous role, which is that we are partners with our local implementing agencies in this case, and we're also in a regulatory role in some ways. That's a challenging mix of roles, and we've all experienced how that is, it's a balancing act in a number of ways. My feeling about this issue is that the idea of having an either-or approach, are we going to put our eggs in the equity grant program or in this possible, reprioritization kind of strategy? It doesn't seem to me, it seems to be a false choice that we do one or the other. I would say, and I think this was the committee's perspective at the time that we retained that language, was we should do both and. The challenge is so significant, it's so pervasive in so many different ways that we should pursue both strategies. And if there are third or fourth or fifth strategies that we should be considering, then let's have that conversation. I realize that that may be the minority view at this table, but I think on behalf of the committee, I wanted to try to articulate the way that we came at that question. And I certainly respect everything that's been shared here. I can't say that I'm totally persuaded out of the view that the committee articulated in that decision, but I wanted to share it on behalf of the committee. Councilman Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it's important to recognize that nobody recommended not using the equity toolkit anymore. It's been good to get the conversation going and help the commissioners understand what the agencies are doing and the agencies understand what the council wants. Nobody's saying get rid of the toolkit. They're just saying the juice is not worth the squeeze on the reordering. It doesn't accomplish anything. It's making enemies, but not accomplishing anything. There is a risk that goes with that, because if you keep that reordering in, you can pretty much guarantee that legislation will be introduced this next year to take away the ability to reorder. We don't know yet what the distribution of power will be at the state level in any of the bodies right now, but if you decide that you want to pick that fight, you risk that not only would there be legislation introduced to get rid of reordering, there could be legislation introduced to get rid of our ability to levy money for the parks at all and not be part of the regional park system anymore. So it's not without risk to pursue this continued strategy of I want both, even if the one hasn't shown any progress. For the people who've actually used it, the commissioners that have been here for a while that have actually used it, they see the value in the toolkit, just not in the reordering part.
Thank you. Commissioner Uruso.
And I'll also say on that we've got a lot of feedback from implementing agencies that what we were setting them up for was kind of a vague requirements that could lead to a surprise, where they would know necessarily coming in how they should be ordering, and it would be kind of at the whim of us to figure out what that should be after the fact. And that's different from everything else that we do on MPOSC, at least, where we set up rules in advance, and things that come to us like master plans or grant requests or acquisition requests are, does it meet the requirements, yes or no, and we either approve or deny. So if we had to have something on that side, we've got we got a lot of comments mentioning carrot and stick. So if you've got the carrot in the competitive grant program and you have some sort of a stick, rather than it reordering, it probably at least needs to somehow take a form where we publish requirements ahead of time and they give us the whole list, and we would either up or down it rather than trying to reorder. Also, to the concerns about whether we have the time or expertise and background knowledge to do that, I don't think we do. But if you needed to have something in there on that side of the equation, it would probably need to be something where we could articulate requirements ahead of time and just say, did you or did you not meet those requirements, rather than more subjective reordering.
Councilmember Barber.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think there's some, could be some benefit to that. And one of the things I think is important to note as we have that discussion is the equity toolkit is fairly new. It's only been around since 2016. I don't recall many cycles of any things have been looked at through that perspective. My experience, when you use a new tool, it takes a little while to get it right. And so there's a strong likelihood that something could change, or we find something that we're finding it's not, as we've been using moving the dial, it's the way we're looking at things are not having the effect that we want. And so I do think we keep using the equity toolkit. It's the reprioritization and almost what feels of a punitive nature to some of the implementing agencies. If we can take that piece out of that discussion, I think that we would get better consensus on this. And I think it's a better use of what our role is in this whole process.
Thank you for your comment. Commissioner.
Just surprised that people are not able to recognize an inequitable situation. So they say they're not qualified to understand the prospect of someone being treated in an inequitable position, then I'm a little surprised. I'm not sure what skills are needed, additional skills would be needed for someone to identify a situation where people are not being treated equitably.
Appreciate the comment. Thank you. Mr. Taylor?
Yeah, I think that when I keep looking at particularly capital investments and kind of the prioritization of their projects, this year looking at the most recent slate of projects, and I think our last meeting we looked at those, and one of the things that was glaring to me is that of the things that when they looked at the equity impact, I mean, some of them the descriptions of equity impact to me were what was a reach, like in some ways. I mean, that we're looking at investment of monies that actually will directly increase the probability that these communities will actually visit the parks, use the parks, and find value in it. It feels different to me. It feels like a different effort, and it feels like a very specific effort in building and build the redevelopment of the Big Rivers Regional Trail and the equity impact that they described to me. I don't see it. Like, I believe they need to do this, and there needs to be another investment in something that will actually engage the communities to actually use those spaces. Does that make that? And that's how I look at it. Much of this is that there needs to be this $1 million for Big Rivers Regional Trail needs another $500,000 to $1 million of investment in the community's actual use of those facilities. And I don't know where to find that money. Like, this is the dilemma for me, right? I want to trust the implementing agency's ability to make decisions around the priorities around capital investment, and I want another $500,000 per project to support the equitable use of those facilities and those amenities, and to capitalize on an investment like that. And I think, to your point, it's and I don't know and unfortunately in terms of the dollars is really where we're struggling right now. Mm-hmm. And I really mean this. Every time we build a bike lane, we need to invest $100,000 per mile of bike lane to get people who aren't using the trails to use the trails. That's how I think we approach equity in a real way. Because every time we do make an investment, what we're looking at is the equitable use of that investment, right? That kind of thing. And so we can't get stuck on the infrastructure development, because that doesn't move the needle, right? We have to continue to invest in infrastructure and make things better, and we have to find the resources to increase the use, right, the benefits of those investments. And I am looking to you and the rest of Met Council to help us find that money.
Thank you for that challenge. I appreciate that, Commissioner.
And so,
one final comment.
Can I just ask? And if we find that money, do we know what to do with it?
You know what? You may not, but I believe there's enough people, and this is where we reach into the community. That would be an ultimate level around community engagement, not around deciding, let's trust the implementing agencies in some regard, that they do understand buildings and parking lots, and they've been doing this, and they are looking at the long-term maintenance of our forests and our lakes. I mean, we can trust them on that. What we will have to do in the next level is actually now connect to the community in a real way and understand the real barriers. Because even for me, one of the things I've had to concede is that maybe if someone goes to Theodore Wirth Park and has a picnic and they use the park, that's enough. Because, like, for me, I really don't want them to just picnic. I want them to get on a bike and bike there and have a picnic and then put their kids in a boat and you know what I mean? There's a whole level of, is that enough? And I think that's where we get that money. We get down to the level of touching people and touching people's lives and what has value to them, and then what will get them to go into the park that's closest to them, see value there, have a positive emotional experience, then reach out into another park, right? So we bring those families from St. Paul to Lake Elmo to, Grand Marais, right? I mean, that. Yeah. That would be monumental, and that they see this as a strategy for building the humans they want in their lives, right? That this outdoors is part of it, and for us in this inner city, one of the great things we haven't leveraged is that urban ag is an integral part of what's happening in our communities. That is a link to us getting people into our regional park system.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I want to conclude our meeting. I think that this has been really a fruitful exchange. I don't know that we reached complete conclusion on this front, but at the same time, I think there are some themes in our conversation that I think are going to be useful. It is 6:30, and I want to respect all of your time. I want to say a couple things first. First, thanks to Chair Yaruso for the chance to do this jointly. And I want to say thanks to members of the MPOS in particular. I think one of the hopes that I had for this opportunity was to create some engagement between the two bodies. And I'm a strong believer, as my colleagues know, in trying to engage with our advisory bodies at any opportunity that we can. And so this has been a great chance to do that. Thank you to our staff for all the work to bring this forum together and to facilitate this kind of exchange. And then finally, I want to say thanks to Councilmember Wolf, who's been a very, I think, faithful liaison between these two bodies in both directions, is my impression. And I want to thank you for that. So with that, I would suggest that we adjourn our meeting. Thank you very much.
Just have
Tony?
one final request to staff. Separate from the actual policy concerns, we did have several comments that talked about procedural things and transparency, and I want to own some of that. So I would just ask that if you could, as soon as possible, get us a red line copy of what we had before us now, and in addition to one for whatever we come up with in a few weeks, just to get that posted so people can go through and look through it. And I know we had several people upset about that. And then I think that we need to have some sort of explanation detailing what we talked about separating out administrative finance stuff. So some explanation of what we expect to be in that versus what should be in policy plan and how it would be updated and whether that's administrative or policy.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. We'll be adjourned.